Thank you for joining us for this special series of interviews with the Democratic candidates seeking to represent you for the Connecticut 1st District in the House of Representatives. I'm Chris MacLaughlin, co-president of the Greater Hartford League of Women Voters. Our goal today is to help you to know the candidate beyond the headlines, to hear who Representative John Larson is, where he comes from, and what fuels his commitment to public service. Representative Larson currently is the U.S. Representative for the 1st District of Connecticut. I'm pleased to be joined today by Cassie Bachman, a member of the Greater Hartford League of Women Voters Board of Directors.
Thank you, Chris. So today we'll start with a conversation that spotlights the person behind the campaign. We want to understand the experiences, values, and mindset that shape how they would approach governing. So, Representative Larson.
Yes, Cassie.
Thank you for being here.
Happy to be here with you both.
So our first question for you is, tell us about your journey. So rather than reciting a resume, we'd love to hear...
from East Hartford to West Hartford or here today?
The journey to you running for the position and kind of the story behind you and why you want to serve.
Well, probably started in the 5th grade in Miss McKinley's class when I was elected class president. But no, actually I grew up in a home, one of 8 kids. My mother, incredible to this day. Imagine having 8 children in 12 years, holding a part-time job, making sure that you read to your children at night, making sure that the lunches, the clothing, everything was prepared the next day, as well as holding a seat on the East Hartford Town Council. She was deeply committed to public service. It was the way that she was raised. And we lived in a little federal housing project, a place called Mayberry Village in East Hartford. And veterans coming home from the Second World War, there's a reason why that generation is called the greatest generation ever, because they persevered through the Great Depression, worked to make ends meet, had a great president that designed plans for the future, and then at 17 years of age, after Pearl Harbor, my dad went off to the Navy, and my mother, who was National Honor Society in the top 20 of her class, went to work down the street. She wanted to go to college, but she went to work down the street at Pratt & Whitney because they needed help at the time. That was that generation. They sacrificed and gave for the future, and when they came home, veterans had first choices on public housing that was created, and Mayberry Village was a public housing unit created primarily for workers that would be at Pratt & Whitney aircraft. But returning veterans from East Hartford had choice, and they initially rent, and then they were able to buy what we call the Brick Mansion on Chandler Street in East Hartford. So I think that's where I derive my values from, and my mother always has been an inspiration. Certainly the pin I wear, John Kennedy, it seems a long time ago, but imagine that was the first time a Catholic was ever elected president of the United States. And on my paper route, every day, everywhere that I would go and knock on a door, especially of all the Irish people, the 2 portraits on the wall were Pope John the 23rd and John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And he didn't disappoint. He was extraordinarily charismatic and visionary, and someone who was inspiring and, asked people to care more about their country than themselves, and recruited people to get involved in public service. And when Caroline gave us these pins, she said, wear it as a reminder of a call to public service. And she quickly added, not elective office, even though that's a public service. But she said, what my dad wanted to see is the whole community, and whether it was the Peace Corps, whether it's VISTA, or whether it's getting involved locally in your community, you've got to be involved in community. Otherwise, the community doesn't work. The democracy doesn't work. So I would say between my mother and John Kennedy, my godfather was a guy named John Shaughnessy, who happened to be one of the first strong mayors of East Hartford. So you could kind of say that it was kind of in my blood growing up to have those kind of influences, and that's why I pursued a life in public service.
Great. So what personal values, this is continuing with what you were just talking about, what personal values are non-negotiable for you in public service? Or what one personal value do you bring to your work?
Well, I think what you try to bring to work every day is compassion and caring. And I think that's what makes communities work. If you, again, can think outside of yourself and what you can do for others, especially when you're able to look out and see the kind of suffering that exists in the world, even in a wealthy country and certainly a wealthy state like the state of Connecticut. You still see that there are, vast inequities, and we're at a point in our history where the wealth disparity in our country is at an all-time high, not too unsimilar to what happened in 1929. And so I think that's vitally important, that those desires to both care about the citizens you're working with, but also demonstrating the compassion. And having lived through a time period where we had the civil rights movement, we had the education movement, we had the women's rights movement, we had the environmental movement, we had the anti-war movement, and yet during that same time we also saw and witnessed the assassination of a president, the assassination of the leading civil rights leader of the time, and the assassination of a senator who would have been president of the United States. And people thought the country could never survive, that cities were actually burning at the time. And so when people talk about how difficult things are now, the country has seen a lot of hard times, but it persevered. And how? When people have those values and care enough about their communities to care, to get out and serve, and to take that extra step. My father would always say as we were shoveling the walks in the summer, now you get up there and do Mrs. O'Brien's and don't you take a dime. I said, can I have a hot chocolate at least, Dad? So.
Well, that's great because that kind of leads into our next question for you. So if reelected, what are your top 3 policy priorities, and why are they the right priorities for the first congressional district?
Well, first of all, the top priorities are affordability and everything that relates to what families are struggling with currently trying to make ends meet, and the costs are way out of control. And so there's got to be a direct attempt to do that. But specifically, coming back and being in the unique position to be a chairman of a committee means that I'm able to amplify the voices of the people I represent. And what will I be amplifying? Social Security. Why? Well, because it represents all 330 million Americans and the more than 80 million who are current recipients. And Social Security, as you know, is more than just a pension. It's the #1 anti-poverty program for the elderly. It's the #1 anti-poverty program for children. It also takes care of spouses, widows, children, dependent children, and also is a disability program that more veterans rely on than they do the VA. And it hasn't been enhanced since Richard Nixon was President of the United States. It needs to be addressed. The can has been kicked down the road too long. And with 10,000 baby boomers a day becoming eligible for Social Security, it's at that crisis point. Are so many other issues, but solving that, who suffers the most in an economy like this? People on fixed income.
Yeah.
And they're predominantly elderly, but it's also, as I indicated, a number of children, all of which Social Security addresses. And so I think from the broadest perspective, meaning that it can impact all 330 million Americans and delivers for them a value. And it's something that they paid for, that they earned. It's their money. The other side often refers to it as an entitlement. I was at a senior center today and saying, again, look, Don't let anyone ever tell you it's an entitlement. It's an earned benefit. You earned it all. They'd say, well, what about the business community? They paid half. It's fully tax reimbursable for them. And who pays for that? The government. And who's the government? We the people. So you pay for the whole thing, and it's an earned benefit that used wisely certainly helps people, especially in their later years, but as you heard me say before, in their formative years, have integrity and dignity.
Thank you. When you hear a policy idea you don't initially agree with, how do you approach evaluating it fairly?
I think the good thing about Congress is the opportunity to have hearings. And I think it's not often covered enough, but you'll see it sometimes on C-SPAN. But I think the most important thing, we should be a nation that, is always talking about the vitality of ideas and new ideas that come forward. But if you don't test those ideas through hearings, where you can have your witnesses come before Congress and then have the members of Congress grill them back and forth or present those issues. And then from the hearing, it then goes back to the committee, so it's further debated as to whether or not that issue is worthy to take to the floor, where it is then further debated and discussed to see if it can pass the muster in one chamber, then go on to the other. And as you know, better than most, the League of Women Voters, how a bill becomes law, it has to pass both chambers and ultimately signed by the president before it becomes law. But that's a good process. But to your point, I don't think we emphasize the importance of ideas and the hearings that need to take place.
That sounds great.
How can Congress restore its constitutional authority? Because
the president currently is ignoring it. Well, the Congress, quite frankly,
ceded its power, so how?
Quite frankly, the Congress, when the president does not follow the rule of law, the Congress does have a remedy. It's called impeachment. And you may know, certainly this president was impeached twice in a previous Congress. And I have filed impeachment proceedings against the president because he is in direct violation of the Constitution, because under Article 1, as we were talking earlier, he is required to come before Congress. Now, in Article 4 of the Constitution, it does give the president in emergencies the time to act immediately when time is of the essence. But it still requires him, and that's why after the Vietnam War, Congress passed the War Powers Act, which again further delineated why he has to come before the Congress, most notably to explain why we're going to war, or as he likes to say, a conflict, and what our exit strategy is. And the people deserve to know it. The reason the Founding Fathers put it in Article 1 is because they wanted the people, whom the House of Representatives and the Senate represent, to make that decision. The president has executive authority. This guy has abused those as well. But the reason I called for that is because he refuses and continues to believe and tell everyone that the Supreme Court has ruled that he's above the law and is not required. They're very careful now trying to say that this is a conflict, but nobody believes that it's a conflict, and shame on our Republican colleagues. Hopefully more of them stand up and call him before the Congress as he's required under the Constitution. And when you violate the Constitution, there are consequences, and you should be held accountable.
So what actions would you take to guarantee voter rights and access to restore the promise of one person, one vote?
Well, I think voting rights is the most critical part of our democracy.
Why, thank you, we agree.
And a democracy can only be strengthened when everyone votes. The thing that should give every American pause in the last election, no matter whether you were for Harris or for Donald Trump. The frightening thing is having to say to people, from my perspective, that Donald Trump has been elected president twice. And in the last election, more people didn't vote than voted for both presidential candidates combined. And that's why what the League of Women Voters is doing is so important. Because without that vote, you're then ceding the democracy to authoritarianism, like we're seeing under Donald Trump. Why? Because he believes that if he can plant fear, which he does very skillfully, take immigration as an example, and people pouring across the borders, and having people fear and be concerned when we are in fact a nation of immigrants. Now let's be clear, the borders have to be enforced, and illegal immigration needs to be dealt with. But it has to be dealt with, as Chris Murphy, our United States Senator, did in a bipartisan manner and passed it in the United States Senate. It was headed to the House, and everyone was hailing the fact that finally we had a piece of legislation, whether you agreed with it or not, that was bipartisan, that addressed the border issues, addressed security, and provided a path forward for citizens. There are other bills that go further than that and are more comprehensive, but that was a compromise in how the Congress usually works. But Donald Trump stepped in and said, no, I don't want the House of Representatives to take that up. And they didn't. And so here we are still with a problem that's solvable, that he doesn't want solved because he believes it's politically potent. And if he can continue to strike fear in the hearts of people and telling them that their jobs are being replaced by immigrants, that they're the ones that are stealing and they're the ones that are committing crimes and they're here illegally. So that right here in West Hartford, where we sit, just 2 weeks ago, a businessman who owns a laundromat and a restaurant was surrounded by 5 cars, people coming out with armed weapons, threw him against the car, threw his arms behind his back, and handcuffed him. We immediately came to the forefront and said, this is wrong and it has to be addressed. And we were joined by every member of the West Hartford Town Council and the mayor. The mayor was away, but I spoke with her directly. And as importantly, the Park Road Association of Businesses. When those business people and individuals stood up, as much as I'd like to think Senator Blumenthal and I have an impact, I don't think the president necessarily gets concerned when he hears Democrats, no matter how right we may be on the issue. But when they see the general public pouring out and standing up for their rights and outraged by one of their fellow citizens, someone who's been here for more than 20 years trying to get his citizenship, and to be there with his sons who are natural-born citizens, and Trump was trying to remove that. Thankfully, the Supreme Court made a good decision there and said, no, if you're born in this country, you are a citizen. Otherwise, if Trump had his way, they would have been attempted to be deported with the father. Well, the noise, the protests, the people speaking out are what made the difference. Same thing happened when Trump tried to get the big, beautiful bill passed and tried to put 20 million people off of health care. And only 4 Republicans stood with Democrats. And Trump said, give me time, I'll be able to flip them. And they gave him an extra 2 weeks. But guess what? It wasn't 4, it ended up being 13 more, so 17 Republicans joined. Why? Because when they went home, the citizens spoke out and said, that affects me. If I'm thrown off of my health care, my family has nothing. And for others, their prices doubled. And so instead of 4, we had 17 Republicans. That's how a democracy is supposed to work.
No, Representative Larson, that actually, your discussion on immigrants leads to another question we have for you. So what actions would you support to restore the Fifth Amendment, the right of due process of law for all, including for immigrants?
Well, I think that the due process is something that is guaranteed under the Constitution. The question then becomes, has it been followed? And that's the issue. And so even in the case, and I think constitutional authorities, we had Jamie Raskin. I don't know if you've seen him on TV or not. Well, he's a member of Congress. He's the ranking Democrat on Judiciary, but he also happens to be a constitutional scholar and a constitutional professor. He was up here, we had him up here to explain these very issues and what was going on with immigration and what was going on. And as he said, everybody has rights. Now, citizens of the United States have special rights, but even people here who aren't yet citizens have rights. Even people that are here illegally, right, and when they're apprehended, have rights. Now, they don't have the same rights as citizens do, but they have rights and responsibilities. And we're a nation of laws. And that's what has to be reemphasized. But if you ignore the law, if you believe in the case of this president that he looks at the Constitution and thinks that's a suggestion, instead of the rule of law that has to be followed by the chief executive of the United States of America. And I think that's what gets people, well, it certainly gets my blood roiled when I see him do this. And it's very disappointing because I know our colleagues on the other side of the aisle understand that what he's doing is wrong. And especially, they even went so far as we have an authority called a resolution of inquiry. Not that you would be aware of that, but it's been a rule that's been on the books since 1879. And what does that rule say? It allows the minority, which also needs a voice in a democracy, and we're currently in the minority, the Democrats, but it allows you to bring a witness before Congress. Why is that important? Because they have to take the oath. And if they lie under oath, that's a criminal offense. So that's what we wanted to make sure that we do and follow the rule of law. I think that's how we were founded. That's what our forefathers have in mind. Was it perfect? Not by any stretch of the imagination. And certainly as people of color, most notably the Africans who were brought here in slavery, but also women.
Yeah.
I mean, when did you get the right to vote? And arguably, as we go out, I love telling the story of Elizabeth Colt. It was actually, and this is a great thing, we made Colt Park a national park. It's one of the proudest things that I've done. And everyone would say, well, that's about guns. I said, no, think about it. It's about a woman and what she did. Most people don't realize that Sam Colt died during the Civil War. So she was actually the person running the company that got us through the Civil War. And the so-called gun that won the West, that was all done by Elizabeth Colt. She also came up with the idea of housing for immigrants when they came here to work, and there were an influx of people who came from Germany and other places. She put them to work. She also came up with the assembly line. And who do you think studied that? Henry Ford and a couple of guys named, Pratt and Whitney. And so they came, and this was all from a woman who couldn't vote. You know who one of her best friends was? Mark Twain.
Oh, I did read that.
The history of Connecticut is so rich.
It is interesting.
You probably can tell I used to teach a little history at one point, but I think that's important.
You've talked about how the Democrats are in the minority. How do you think you can be effective in Congress whether or not Democrats take back the majority in November?
You have to continue to speak out and stand up, and let your views be known. But I think Democrats also, and it's not enough in Congress to criticize the president. And certainly he gives you a lot of ammunition. But you also have to indicate to the American people what you stand for. And under the new leadership of Hakeem Jeffries, who will be the next Speaker of the House, I believe that we're going to take back the House. I believe we should have taken it back the last time, but we're only 4 seats away. And I believe we're going to take back the House, and he will be the first Black Speaker of the House of Representatives. I've truly been blessed that in the time I've been in Congress, I saw the first woman Speaker of the House and worked to help make her that first Speaker, and Nancy Pelosi. We saw the first Black President of the United States in terms of Barack Obama. My seatmate on the Ways and Means Committee was John Lewis, who would take us back every year to the Edmund Pettus Bridge and recreate that walk across the bridge when they stood up for civil rights. That wasn't that long ago. And bringing my children there to walk across that bridge, those are the kinds of things. But speaking up and standing up for democracy is something that's a daily job. You know, there's no days off.
Representative Larson, there's so much more we want to talk to you
I
about.
could, as you could probably tell, I enjoy this. And
well, we still have about 2 minutes left. We wanted to get into more about the environmental aspects of everything. You mentioned it in the beginning, and then you mentioned taking your grandchildren, but we don't have time for that right now. So perhaps at our upcoming debate, you can bring that up. But is there anything in about
the Green New Deal is absolutely important to, not only was it important in its inception, but also, and I'll just say this briefly, but also, if you don't believe that there's climate change, and just in the last couple of weeks have seen and witnessed what we have here in the state of Connecticut, you haven't taken a walk outside lately. And it's that important to future generations that we make sure the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the ability for future generations to survive is adamant.
Yes.
What good is a democracy and the freedom if the air you breathe and the water you drink are not clean?
I agree completely. Are there any other, in about 30 seconds, any final thoughts you have?
In about 30
Have you ever
in
talked
about
to
30 seconds. I would say this, going back to something we said at the outset. Every American should be concerned that when you have an election and more Americans don't vote than voted for both candidates, yes, that means there's something wrong with the party system and what they're doing and how they're presenting themselves. But think about how authoritarian power works, is people become dissatisfied with existing power. Fear is created and things aren't working. And if you can prevent people from exercising their constitutional responsibility, then a very small minority can rule a larger majority. And that's how authoritarianism thrives. We've got to stop that. The League of Women Voters should be praised for making sure and encouraging people to go out to vote. No matter whether you're Democrat, Republican, unaffiliated, whatever the case may be, you've got to exercise your right to vote. If you give up that responsibility, you're ceding that to authoritarianism.
Well, Representative Larson, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We appreciate you being here. We ask that people remember to get out and vote on August 11th. Early voting starts on August 3rd. And for early voting locations and times, contact your town's registrar of voters. For your information, the Greater Hartford League of Women Voters has an online voters guide. You just need to go to Vote 411 online and type in your address, and information about the candidates will be available to you. Also, the Greater Hartford League of Women Voters is happy to report that we will be sponsoring a forum for all 4 candidates running for the Democratic primary on August 11th. The forum will be held at the Hartford Public Library on July 27th at 6:30 p.m. You can get more information on the Greater Hartford League of Women Voters website. Thank you again.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Cassie.
Yes.